In early 1943, the war in North Africa reached a breaking point. The once confident forces of the Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, were no longer advancing across the desert. They were retreating, exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly surrounded. For years, these soldiers had been told they were part of an unstoppable force. Propaganda had painted them as superior, disciplined, technologically advanced, destined to win. But by the spring of 1943, that illusion was collapsing in the harsh sands of Tunisia. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Supply lines were constantly attacked by Allied aircraft. Food became scarce. Ammunition was rationed. And as Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, the reality became unavoidable. Surrender was no longer a question of if, but when. For many German soldiers, the idea of surrendering to the enemy was terrifying. Nazi propaganda had spent years shaping their expectations. They had been told that capture by the Allies, especially the Americans, would mean humiliation, abuse, or even death. Stories circulated among troops of brutal treatment, of prisoners being starved or executed. Whether true or not, these fears felt real in the final days of resistance. When the collapse finally came in May 1943, it was swift. Tens of thousands of German and Italian troops laid down their weapons. Many of them expected the worst. Instead of bullets or beatings, they were met with something they did not understand: order, structure, and adherence to international law under the Geneva Convention. Captured soldiers were disarmed, searched, and processed. They were given water. Food rations were distributed. Wounded prisoners received medical attention, sometimes from the very enemy they had been fighting days before. For some, this was the first crack in the narrative they had believed for years, but it was only the beginning. Soon, rumors began spreading among the prisoners. They were not going to remain in North Africa. They were going to be transported across the ocean to the United States. For many, this sounded unbelievable. America had been portrayed as a distant industrial giant, but also as a chaotic and morally weak society. The idea of being taken there as a prisoner created a new kind of anxiety. What would happen to them in a foreign land, thousands of miles from home? The journey itself was tense. Prisoners were loaded onto transport ships under heavy guard. The Atlantic Ocean in 1943 was still a dangerous place, filled with German U-boats hunting Allied vessels. Ironically, these prisoners now depended on the very navy they had once considered the enemy for their survival. Below deck, conditions were cramped. Hundreds of men shared tight quarters, unsure of what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Some expected the ships to be sunk. Others feared they would be used as bargaining tools or forced into labor camps under brutal conditions. Conversations among prisoners often circled back to the same question: what does the enemy really want with us? Days turned into weeks as the ships crossed the Atlantic. Eventually, the coastline of North America came into view. For many of these soldiers, it was the first time they had ever seen the United States, not as an abstract enemy in propaganda films, but as a real place. Upon arrival, they were processed again, this time on American soil. Guards were present, but something about them seemed different. They were not shouting. They were not aggressive. Orders were given calmly. Procedures followed efficiently. The prisoners were organized, documented, and prepared for transport inland. Then came another surprise. Instead of being held in overcrowded coastal prisons, they were placed on trains and sent deep into the American interior, far from the front lines, far from the war they had just left behind. Through the windows, some prisoners caught glimpses of small towns, farms, and cities. What they saw didn't match what they had been told. There were no signs of collapse, no visible shortages, no chaos. Instead, there was movement, activity, and a sense of stability that felt almost surreal during wartime. As the trains moved through the vast American landscape, a quiet realization began to form among some of the prisoners. This country was not what they expected.
It was larger, more organized, and seemingly untouched by the destruction that had become normal in Europe. But uncertainty still dominated their thoughts. Where were they being taken? What kind of camps awaited them? Would this apparent order and calm give way to something darker once they arrived? Eventually, the train slowed and stopped at various nakats across the Midwest. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, and barracks came into view. These were prisoners of war camps, secure, controlled, and clearly designed to hold large numbers of captives. At first glance, they looked exactly as one might expect, isolated, fenced, and guarded. But first impressions can be misleading. As the prisoners stepped off the trains and into the camps, they prepared themselves for harsh discipline and deprivation. Instead, they were met with structured intake procedures, medical checks, and something else entirely unexpected: organization without cruelty. They were assigned sleeping quarters, issued basic supplies, and informed of camp rules. There were restrictions, of course. They were prisoners, after all. But there was also a sense of predictability and order that felt strangely different from the chaos they had just experienced on the battlefield. For many of these men, this marked the beginning of a profound shift, one that would continue to unfold in ways they could not yet imagine. The enemy they had been taught to hate was beginning to reveal a different face, and behind the barbed wire, the war was about to take on a completely new meaning.
When the prisoners first settled into the camps, most of them remained cautious. Nothing about their situation felt normal. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by guards, enclosed by barbed wire. Every instinct told them to stay alert. Years of propaganda had conditioned them to expect cruelty sooner or later. Many believed the kindness they had seen so far was temporary, an act that would eventually give way to something harsher. But as the days passed, that expectation began to crack. The daily routine inside the camps was strict, but not brutal. Prisoners were woken at regular hours, counted, and assigned tasks. Meals were served consistently: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And almost immediately, something stood out. The food was not only sufficient, it was often better than what many of them had been receiving during the final months of fighting in North Africa. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, even coffee. For soldiers who had grown used to rationing and hunger, this was deeply unsettling. Some prisoners suspected a trick. They wondered if the Americans were trying to manipulate them, or if this was simply a temporary measure. But the quality and consistency did not change. Day after day, the meals continued. There was no visible attempt to starve or weaken them. Medical care was another shock. Injured and sick prisoners were treated by trained personnel. Wounds were cleaned properly. Infections were managed. In some cases, German prisoners found themselves being treated with the same care as American soldiers. This contradicted everything they had been told about their enemy. The guards, too, were different from what they expected. They were armed, of course, and maintained discipline, but they did not behave with constant aggression. Orders were given clearly, without unnecessary shouting or violence. Some guards even engaged in brief conversations, asking simple questions or responding to requests. For prisoners raised on strict military hierarchy and fear-based discipline, this behavior was confusing. Inside the camps, the physical environment added to the sense of contradiction. The barracks were basic but functional: bunk beds, blankets, heating where necessary. Sanitation facilities were maintained. There were systems in place to manage waste, water, and hygiene. Compared to the collapsing infrastructure many had seen in wartime Europe, this level of organization stood out. Then came something even more unexpected: access to time. In war, time is consumed by survival. Every moment is focused on orders, movement, danger. But inside the camps, prisoners suddenly had hours with nothing to do, and the Americans filled that time in ways the prisoners had never anticipated. Libraries appeared inside some camps, shelves filled with books, some in German, others translated, literature, history, even technical manuals. At first, many prisoners ignored them, but curiosity slowly took over.
Some began reading, passing books to others, discussing ideas. It was a quiet change, but an important one. There were also organized activities. Sports, for example, became common. Football matches inside the camp fences drew attention and participation. For a brief moment, the war seemed distant. Men who had recently been fighting each other across continents were now kicking a ball on the same field, separated only by circumstance. Another major turning point was labor. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned non-combat work, and many were sent outside the camps during the day. They worked on farms, in forests, or on infrastructure projects. This was not forced labor in the way many had feared. In fact, they were paid small wages for their work. For some prisoners, this was the first direct interaction with American civilians. Farmers needed help. Crops had to be harvested. With many American men deployed overseas, labor shortages were real. German POWs became a temporary solution. These encounters added another layer of the growing sense of confusion. Civilians did not always show hatred. Some were distant, others curious, a few even friendly. There were moments of tension, of course, but they were not the constant hostility the prisoners had been prepared for. And then was the scale of everything. Even from within the camps, prisoners could sense it. Trains passing in the distance, loaded with materials, endless movement of goods, stories from work details about massive farms, busy rail lines, and factories operating at full capacity. The United States did not feel like a country under strain. It felt like a machine running at enormous speed. For soldiers of the Wehrmacht who had been told that Germany was technologically and industrially superior, this was deeply unsettling. If this was what America looked like far from the front lines, what did its full power look like? Still, not everyone accepted what they were seeing. Some prisoners held tightly to their beliefs. They dismissed the conditions as propaganda or as a temporary illusion. Loyalists within the camps sometimes pressured others not to trust what they experienced. The psychological battle did not end with capture, it simply changed form. But for many, doubt had already taken root. Every meal, every interaction, every quiet moment inside the camp chipped away at the image they had carried with them into captivity. The enemy was no longer a distant idea shaped by speeches and slogans. It was something real, something visible, and increasingly something that did not match the story they had been told. And this was only the beginning.
As the weeks turned into months, the experience of captivity began to shift from survival to observation. What had once been a confusing environment slowly became something else entirely, a window into a system far larger and more powerful than anything most of the prisoners had imagined. The real shock was no longer the food or the treatment, it was the scale of the world surrounding them. Work assignments became the key to this realization. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, German prisoners were allowed, and in many cases expected, to work. At first, this seemed like confirmation of their fears. Labor, in their minds, meant exploitation. But what they encountered instead was something far more complex. Many prisoners were sent to farms across the American Midwest. There, they worked alongside or under the supervision of local farmers. The tasks were physical, planting, harvesting, repairing fences, but the environment was not hostile. The land stretched endlessly, far beyond anything most of them had seen in Europe. Fields extended to the horizon, filled with crops that seemed almost excessive in quantity. For soldiers who had witnessed shortages and rationing, this abundance was difficult to process. Food was not scarce here, it was everywhere. Grain silos stood full, livestock was plentiful. Even small farms appeared capable of producing more than entire regions back home. Others were assigned to railroads and infrastructure projects. They helped maintain tracks, load cargo, and assist in transportation systems that never seemed to stop moving. Trains passed constantly, carrying raw materials, equipment, and supplies. Everything was organized, scheduled, and executed with a level of efficiency that stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly strained logistics of wartime Germany. But the most profound realization came from those who worked near or inside industrial facilities. Factories in the United States operated on a scale that many prisoners had never imagined possible. Massive buildings filled with machinery, assembly lines running continuously, producing vehicles, equipment, and materials at incredible speed. Steel production alone was overwhelming. Furnaces burned day and night, shaping the raw material of war into tanks, ships, and weapons. Some prisoners later described the experience as watching an unstoppable force. There was no sense of limitation, only expansion. If something was needed, it was produced. If more was required, production increased. The system adapted, scaled, and accelerated. For men who had been taught that the Third Reich possessed superior industry and innovation, this was a moment of quiet but powerful contradiction. Germany's factories were advanced, but they were also vulnerable, limited by resources, bombed by Allied air raids, and stretched thin across multiple fronts. Here, in the United States, the industrial base seemed untouched, protected by distance and fueled by vast natural resources. The numbers, when they became known, only reinforced this impression. Over 400,000 German prisoners were held across the United States during the war. Many of them contributed labor that supported agriculture and infrastructure, freeing American workers to focus on industrial production. It was a system that fed itself, strengthened itself, and showed no visible signs of breaking. And the prisoners were inside it. They were not just hearing about American strength, they were seeing it, participating in it, and in some cases, helping sustain it. This created a strange and uncomfortable awareness. The war they had fought on distant battlefields was being decided in part by the very system they now witnessed from within. Conversations among prisoners began to change. At first, discussions focused on survival, escape, or rumors from the front. Now they turned toward comparison. How could Germany compete with this? How could any nation match this level of output, this consistency, this scale? Some tried to hold on to familiar explanations. They argued that American production was inefficient, that quality mattered more than quantity, that Germany's technology would ultimately prevail. But these arguments became harder to defend with each passing day, because the evidence was everywhere. Endless trains, overflowing storage facilities, factories that never seemed to sleep. Even the roads were filled with movement, trucks transporting goods across vast distances with speed and reliability. It was not just industry, it was coordination, a system where every part supported the others. For many prisoners, this realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, through daily exposure. A field here, a factory there, a passing train loaded with steel. Each detail added to a growing understanding that the balance of the war was not what they had believed. And with that understanding came a deeper, more unsettling thought. If this was the enemy's strength, if this was what lay behind the front lines, then the outcome of the war might already be decided. No speech, no propaganda film, no order from a commanding officer could fully counter what they were seeing with their own eyes. The idea of victory, once so certain, began to feel distant, abstract, unreal. Behind the barbed wire, far from the sound of gunfire, a different kind of battle was unfolding, not of weapons or tactics, but of perception. And for many German prisoners, that battle was already being lost.
The longer the prisoners stayed in the camps, the more their perception of the world and of the enemy began to shift. What had started as confusion slowly became something more profound. Access to libraries, newspapers, and education programs allowed prisoners to see a side of the United States they had never imagined. For men raised on the relentless messaging of Nazi propaganda, this exposure was unsettling, even revolutionary. Books became a quiet escape and a tool for reflection. Shelves contained literature in German, histories of the world, scientific works, and practical manuals. At first, many prisoners ignored them, skeptical that anything useful could come from reading in captivity. But curiosity grew. Soldiers began sharing books, forming small discussion groups, and debating ideas. Some explored technical manuals that revealed industrial methods far more advanced than anything they had seen in Germany. Others read about philosophy, politics, or the history of nations, realizing that the world was far more complex than the rigid worldview they had been taught. Newspapers were another revelation. Camp libraries provided copies of American papers, giving prisoners insights into daily life, politics, and the ongoing war effort. The contrast between what they read and the stories told by Nazi media was stark. Headlines described prosperity, innovation, and social organization, nothing like the chaos and oppression their leaders claimed defined America. For many, it was as if a veil had been lifted. Education programs reinforced these lessons. Some camps organized classes for prisoners in English, mathematics, technical skills, and even cultural studies. Participating in these lessons challenged deeply held assumptions. Men who had once seen themselves as the elite of a superior military and society began to question the foundation of those beliefs. They saw competence, efficiency, and humanity in the people they had been taught to despise. Work details outside the camp added yet another dimension. Farmers, factory supervisors, and local civilians interacted with prisoners on a regular basis. In many cases, these encounters were polite, sometimes even cordial. Prisoners saw that Americans were not only capable of managing vast industrial and agricultural systems, but could do so with empathy toward the people contributing to that system, even prisoners from an enemy army. The contrast with their experiences in occupied Europe or the brutal campaigns in North Africa was impossible to ignore. Conversations among the prisoners began to shift. Early discussions had focused on escape, survival, or complaints about captivity. Now, debates turned toward morality, society, and the apparent disconnect between propaganda and reality. Men who had once accepted slogans and orders without question began questioning them. Some expressed guilt at their previous beliefs, others worried about what awaited them if they returned home with this newfound perspective. Some began keeping diaries, recording what they saw and how it affected their thinking. These first-hand accounts, collected after the war, reveal the deep cognitive dissonance experienced by men raised to see Americans as decadent, weak, and morally corrupt. Instead, they witnessed organization, technological mastery, and even kindness in the enemy. The irony was not lost on them. The battlefield had been brutal and destructive, but the true challenge to their beliefs occurred far from the guns and bombs. The war inside the camps, quiet, subtle, psychological, was reshaping their understanding of the world. The power of propaganda, once unassailable, began to crumble under the weight of direct experience. By the end of several months, a remarkable transformation had taken root. Soldiers who had arrived expecting hatred and brutality began to accept that their preconceptions were incomplete and in many cases wrong. This internal shift did not erase fear, loyalty, or the trauma of war, but it planted a seed of critical thought. Some would carry this seed for the rest of their lives, altering their understanding of enemy and ally alike. The camps, confined and controlled, became paradoxically liberating spaces of reflection. Surrounded by barbed wire, prisoners discovered a world of order, education, and humanity that no military drill or battlefield experience could have taught them. It was here, behind the wire, that many German soldiers first confronted the possibility that their leaders had misled them, and that the enemy was not the monster they had been told. Even small personal interactions left lasting impressions. Prisoners who received genuine concern from guards or compassion from civilians began to record names and faces, small stories of kindness that contradicted years of indoctrination. They realized that while they were considered the enemy, they were still treated with a level of respect that was almost unimaginable given their previous beliefs. By the time many were released or reassigned, the psychological impact of the camps had changed them profoundly. The war's greatest irony was clear. The battlefield had tested their physical strength, but it was life behind the wire that tested their minds, reshaping perceptions in ways no combat could.
For some, this quietly transformative experience would define their understanding of humanity for the rest of their lives.
As the war in Europe drew closer to its end, the prisoners in the American camps began to confront a reality they had never anticipated. The conflict that had defined their lives for years was ending far from the fences that had enclosed them. For soldiers who had once believed victory was inevitable for the Third Reich, the truth was unavoidable. Germany was losing. And yet, inside the camps, there was no celebration, no fanfare, only quiet observation, reflection, and the growing understanding that the world they had fought against was both powerful and complex. Some prisoners received news of Germany's defeats through newspapers, word of mouth, or letters from home. Cities were falling, leaders were captured or dead, and the Nazi regime was crumbling. For men who had been raised on propaganda that painted the Allies as weak, immoral, and chaotic, this was a profound shock. It was one thing to hear about loss on a battlefield. It was another to witness it through the lens of a society that had continued to thrive, grow, and maintain order while the war raged. Many prisoners had spent months working on farms, railways, and in factories. They had seen firsthand the sheer scale of American industry and agriculture, the relentless productivity, and the organization that made defeat seem inevitable. Some described a sense of awe, a quiet respect for a system that could mobilize so efficiently without resorting to cruelty. This was not the enemy they had been told to hate. This was a society operating at a level they could barely comprehend. As the months passed, discussions among prisoners increasingly centered on what they would do once the war ended. Would they return home to a Germany in ruins, to families devastated, to cities bombed into rubble? Some began to imagine life beyond the camps, questioning the ideologies they had been taught to uphold. Memoirs and interviews conducted years later revealed that many soldiers realized that the lessons of captivity had changed them in ways they could not have anticipated. Some prisoners even formed friendships with Americans, whether through work assignments, organized camp events, or simple daily interactions. These relationships were subtle but meaningful. The guards who had treated them with decency, the farmers who had welcomed their labor, and the civilians who had shown curiosity or kindness, all of it challenged the narrative that had been drilled into them for years. Soldiers who had once viewed the United States as a distant, decadent enemy now saw it as a country of discipline, productivity, and unexpected humanity. For those returning to Germany after the war, the psychological impact of captivity remained profound. Many carried back a new perspective on society, governance, and morality. They had learned that enemies could act with honor, that power did not require cruelty, and that propaganda could shape perception far more than reality. Some applied these lessons in rebuilding their lives, questioning old loyalties, and trying to understand the wider world beyond the narrow lens of Nazi ideology. The irony of it all was striking. On the battlefield, the war had been a struggle of life and death, marked by destruction, fear, and violence. But it was behind the barbed wire, in the quiet camps of the American Midwest, that the greatest transformations occurred. Soldiers who had been prepared for hatred and brutality instead encountered order, respect, and opportunity for reflection. It was there that they confronted their beliefs, reconsidered their assumptions, and discovered a humanity they had been taught to reject. Even decades later, former POWs recalled the unexpected lessons of those months. They spoke of libraries and work assignments, of guards who treated them fairly, of civilians who interacted with them politely or kindly. They remembered how the United States had functioned like a machine, productive and organized, while the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of war. These memories challenged the idea that their enemies were monsters and reinforced a more nuanced understanding of morality, society, and power. Ultimately, the story of German prisoners in America is one of paradox and revelation. The greatest irony was that the war they had fought so desperately to win had already been decided, not just by weapons or strategy, but by the industrial might, organizational skill, and human decency they witnessed far from the front lines. Their captivity became a mirror, reflecting a world that contradicted everything they had been taught and forcing them to reconcile the ideals of their past with the reality of what they had seen. In the end, the barbed wire, guard towers, and fences that had seemed like symbols of imprisonment became, in another sense, instruments of enlightenment. Behind the wire, men who had expected hatred discovered humanity. Those who had been trained to see enemies as monsters discovered respect, competence, and unexpected kindness. And through that transformation, they began to understand that the true lessons of war were not always written in battles or victories, but in the quiet, unseen moments that shape perception, belief, and understanding. By the time the last prisoners returned home, they carried with them memories that would last a lifetime, of a country that treated its captives with dignity, of labor and education that reshaped thought, and of a profound, ironic truth. Sometimes the enemy is not who you think, and the most unexpected victories are the ones fought within.